So in these past few lessons, we've been learning about when parallel lines are cut by a transversal, and that's the figure that we have here. We've been learning about what type of angle pairs are created, and we've recently started talking about how to tell if those angles are congruent or supplementary to each other. So let's first review just the types of angle pairs that we have. So here in this table below, the first one to look at would be A and H. Well, I see that my transversal is right here. That's the one cutting through the parallel lines. And A and H are on opposite sides of that, so I know it's alternate. And then A and H are outside of the parallel lines, so these would be alternate exterior angles. C and E, this time they're on the same side of that transversal, and they're in between those parallel lines. So C and E would be an example of same side interior. B and F. Well, I have one that's on the outside and one that's on the inside, so they're not really interior or exterior. Instead, what B and F have in common is they're both kind of in that top right section of each of their groups. So B and F are our newest corresponding angles. Remember, that means they match up in location. And then finally, I have D and E. They're on alternate sides of the transversal in between those parallel lines. So those are alternate interior angles. So next up, we're going to decide, are these given pairs congruent to each other or supplementary to each other? I'm going to re-walk you through the color coding trick that I like to do. I first like to start by highlighting a pair of vertical angles because I know that those two would be congruent to each other. Then from there, I look for their corresponding angles, so that would be F and G, and I know that those are equal to each other. So if they're congruent, they're either both going to be highlighted or they're both not going to be highlighted, but they're going to be the same. If they're supplementary to each other, that means I have one that's highlighted and one that's not. So if I look at our alternate exteriors, A and H, they're both not highlighted, so they're the same in that coding, so those would be congruent. C and E, here I have one that is and one that's not, so that tells me it's supplementary. B and F, both highlighted, that means congruent. And finally, D and E, both not highlighted, again, they're the same, so that means congruent. So what we're going to do in this video is using that knowledge of if they're congruent or if they're supplementary to help me find missing values. So here are two examples below where instead of just labels, we actually have expressions for each of these angles. So how can I use the fact if they're congruent or if they're supplementary to help me solve for X? Now this page that you see here, I made available to print. So what I recommend doing is actually printing these off and having them in front of you and solving alongside while I am. So we're going to start, I zoomed in on these top two problems. And again, the goal would be, how do I solve for X using the diagram and using what I know about transversals? So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to first do my color coding. So I see this and I'm going to start to highlight things that I know are equal. So if I look, the first two angles that I know would be the same would be these two. And then matching along with that would be these two. If you notice, this one was in that group. So all of the ones that I just highlighted would be the same. So now what I have to determine would be, okay, the two expressions that I have, are they the same? Are those angles congruent or are those angles supplementary? Since I have one that's highlighted and one that's not, that tells me that these would be supplementary. They are not the same. So what supplementary angles means is that those together add up to 180 degrees. So here in this equation, I would actually show that I'm adding the two angles together. So I have this first angle and then the second angle. And supplementary means they have a sum of 180 degrees. So that would be my original equation that I set up. Now, if you look, that looks kind of messy because I have two variable terms, two constants. So what I want to do next is try to combine like terms to simplify. So here I would have 13x, and then 7 plus 17 would be 24, and together that's going to equal 180. So in continuing to solve this, and I'm going to do this part quickly, I would subtract 24 from each side. That leaves me with 156. That's what I would divide by 13. And I would get a final answer of x equals 12, or 12 degrees. I'm going to start off this next example in the same way. I'm going to choose two angles to highlight. It doesn't matter which ones. All I'm looking for is if they're the same or not. So here I'll start off with these two. So this one would be included in that. And then I'll start with these two. Okay, because those correspond to the ones that I chose to highlight. So here, a similar example. I have one that's highlighted and one that's not. That means these two would be supplementary to each other. Okay, they are not color-coded the same. So my equation would be the same as last time. I'm going to take those two individual pieces and add them together to equal 180 degrees, because that's the definition of what supplementary means. Same starting off point, I'm going to combine like terms. So 11x plus 7x combines to 18x. Negative 9 minus 9 more gives me a negative 18. And that would be equal to 180. So from here, this time I'm actually going to add 18 to both sides. So I would have 18x is equal to 198. And then taking 198 divided by 18 gets me my final answer of 11 degrees. So in both of these, when I did my color coding, I realized that they were not the same. So that means they're supplementary to each other. So what you had to do when you know that they're supplementary is add them together and give them a sum of 180. That's how you would set up your equation and then solve from there. In the bottom two examples, we're going to look at what to do if they are the same. So I start off the same way. I choose, an angle pair to start color coding. I know they're the same. So here, two vertical angles, those have to be equal. So that one is included. And then I go to those corresponding angles, which would be these two. So this one actually is included as well. So I see that those two angles are color coded the same. That means they are congruent. And congruent means equal. So there's nothing to do with adding them together. I don't know what their sum is. Instead, what I know is that this first angle of 5x plus 6 has to be equal, congruent, to 8x minus 39. So when they are congruent, you set those two equal to each other. So here I have variables on both sides. I need to move them all over to one side. So to do that, I'm going to subtract 5x. So I would get 3x minus 39. I would add 39. And I would divide by 3. So I get a final answer of x equals 15 degrees. If you notice, I have something new on these bottom questions that says angle measures. So what you're doing here is figuring out, okay, if x equals 15, what does the angle have to be? So to do that, I'm actually going to plug in 15 for wherever I see x. So in that first angle, I would be doing 5 times 15 and then plus 6. So 5 times 15 gives me 75, plus 6 gives me 81 degrees. Now these are congruent, so theoretically that 8x minus 39 should also work out to be 81. I'm going to just double check that as a way to make sure that I did it correct. So 8 times 15 minus 39. So 8 times 15 gives me 120, minus 39 is also equal to 81, so that's good news. So using the fact that x was 15, that means those angles would be 81 degrees each. You might want to pause the video right now and see if you can figure out the second one on your own. If not, if you still feel like you need to hear one more, let it keep playing. So I'm going to start by highlighting angles that I know are congruent. Doesn't matter where you start. Just for an example, I'm going to highlight these two. But it's really just kind of a gut feeling for you of which ones you would think to do first. Corresponding to those would be down here. So why I chose these was just to show you that it still works even if they're both not highlighted. Remember, we're really concerned of, are they the same or are they different? So here, the fact that my two angles that I'm looking at are both not highlighted, they have the same coding, means they are also congruent. So if you're ever in a situation where you run into that, just know that if they're the same, regardless of highlighted or not, they're congruent. So again, congruent means equal. So I'm going to set up my equation by taking both angles and setting them equal to each other. So here I would have a 15x minus 2 from that top angle equals 11x plus 34 from that bottom angle. Moving my variables to one side, I would get 4x minus 2 equal to 34. Adding 2. And then dividing by 4. So I would get x equals 9 degrees. From there, I'm then going to use the x to find those angle measures. So plugging 9 in for wherever I see x. So I'd have 15 times 9 minus 2 from the top angle, 11 times 9 plus 34 for that bottom angle. Again, they should be the same thing. I got 133 for this first one, but just to double check, typing those into my calculator, and they do get the same. One thing to note, for those top two, since they were supplementary to each other, it would not be the case where the angle measures would be the same. Here I would actually want to plug in both because I would get two different angle measures. And what I'm looking for there is, are those two angle measures that I got actually supplementary to each other? So if I were to add those final answers together, they should equal 180. All right, so just a quick summary when you go to do this on your own. First thing you should decide is, are they congruent or are they supplementary? Again, I like to highlight or do that color coding, but you could also reason your way through it as well. From there, you're going to set up your equation. If they are congruent, so color coding means both highlighted or both not, you're going to set them equal to each other. If they're supplementary, meaning one ended up being highlighted and one was not, you're going to add them and set them equal to 180 degrees. Once you have your equation set up, see if you can simplify, combine like terms, all that, and then solve. Some questions might ask you to then find what the angles are. So those would be like those last two examples where you take your x value and plug them in to evaluate. Good luck. Let me know if you have questions.